who moved from Damascus to Qatar during the Arab Spring. It's sort of what I would consider an ill-fated move, when he believed that the Muslim Brotherhood's Reform and Justice Party in Egypt under Mohamed Morsi was actually going to consolidate control democratically in Egypt and then begin to open things up between Egypt and Gaza. And Qatar was supplying a lot of the money for the Egyptian government, as well as, the propaganda apparatus through Al Jazeera Arabic. That failed. And we saw a return to the armed struggle. Hamas declined in political popularity after the failure of the Arab Spring, but the consensus within Palestine is all near total support for the Al-Qassam Brigades, which is an underground armed organization that has been fostered by Hamas, but which makes its own military decisions, and whose leadership are folk heroes among people in the Gaza Strip and throughout Palestine. And I think there's very little reporting on this group for a reason, and it's because Israel wants to portray it as just simply like ISIS. But this is an organization that is using typical traditional guerrilla tactics and is fighting for national liberation against a settler colonial movement and government and military. And as none other than Emil Hokaim, who is from the British state-funded International Institute for Security Studies in London, said, they are more Viet Cong than ISIS. They're essentially an Islamist Viet Cong that has reverse engineered Israel's military and is now, as we speak, exploiting Israel's weaknesses in the field and causing many Israeli casualties, which the Israeli military appears to be covering up. So I want to talk a little.
Lead them.
So the Al-Qassam Brigades, as I mentioned earlier in this stream, is led by Mohammed Daif. That's not his real name. He's a very mysterious figure whose name essentially just means guest, because he's always moving from location to location, staying with various families, supporters, a very close circle. He doesn't use phones. He communicates only through a close circle of associates. He's survived 5 assassination attempts. I was sort of a witness to the last assassination attempt on him, which was carried out by the Israeli Air Force with a GBU bunker buster bomb. They struck an apartment building in the Al Nasser neighborhood in the middle of Gaza City. And I just happened to be nearby in the Al Rimal neighborhood carrying out an interview. And I heard this just giant explosion, and I saw a flash of light.
This was in 2014.
This is in 2014, in August 2014. But again, he survived, and they killed his entire family. He's severely disfigured. It's said that he can only walk a short distance. But he maintains superhero, folk hero status within Palestine. His spokesman is known as Abu Obaida. The Israeli military has claimed to identify him. Al-Sharq al-Awsat, the Saudi paper, has identified him as a student of Islamic studies at, I think, Al-Azhar University, someone who's highly educated. I've actually seen him speak at a press conference in the rubble east of Gaza City after the 2014 war. And when he speaks, everyone in the refugee camp stops to listen, gathers around TVs, and he's sending a very clear message to the Israeli military and taunting them in the process. There's a song that kind of honors him. It's like a pop song that honors him in Palestine. Oh, Abu Obaida, your words are like gunpowder. And so he too is sort of a folk hero who is not understood in the West, but he has given a few interviews to Western reporters. And he emphasizes, as according to the doctrine, to the extent there is one, of Mohammed Daif, that they prefer to fight soldiers, that their preference is to fight soldiers on their own terrain and to use military tactics instead of the suicide bombing tactics that we saw in the earlier stage of the Al-Qassam Brigades. The Al-Qassam Brigades were sort of made their presence known when Hamas was in its quietest phase before it began running for elections. It had one Carl Gustav rifle, which barely even fired. It was one gun, and they'd march down the street in Gaza City with the gun to frighten the Israeli occupation forces, who were then inside Gaza protecting the settlers. Their first de facto leader was named Ahmed Akel, and he carried out attacks on settlers in Hebron, then escaped from Hebron dressed as a settler back into the Gaza Strip, and was eventually killed in a raid. He was succeeded by Yahya Aash, who then began, it was Aash who implemented the tactic of suicide bombing after the fanatical Jewish settler Baruch Goldstein from Brooklyn, New York, massacred scores of Palestinians in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron in a deliberate attempt to shatter the Oslo Accords, the Oslo peace process. And so this was revenge, a way of saying, you can't just slaughter us without an answer. Aash was killed by the Israeli military during a ceasefire under Shimon Peres, this so-called peacenik. And it's important to note that how the Israeli leadership has always disrupted the peace process. He killed him at a time when Aash and all Palestinian factions had agreed to a ceasefire so that they could negotiate this peace process. How was he killed? His best friend's uncle handed him a phone, like a cell phone type device, and it was detonated by a nearby Israeli helicopter, and it blew his brains out. The friend's uncle turned out to be an Israeli collaborator. So then the leadership passed to Salah Shahada, who was a lecturer at Islamic University in Gaza, very educated man. He continued to lead operations throughout the Second Intifada, which were very ugly. It was a time when, their military capacity was very low. So that's why you saw the use of suicide bombing, but there were also armed confrontations with the Israelis. Salah Shahada was killed in an airstrike, a targeted, deliberate airstrike on a civilian apartment block in 2002. Just to kill him, the Israeli Air Force killed maybe 30 other people, sort of like what we saw yesterday in the Jabalia refugee camp. And it was at that time that the George W. Bush administration actually criticized Israel and condemned that attack, because once again, it was carried out during a ceasefire in order to disrupt the so-called peace process, which Shahada and all the other factions had agreed to at that point. That's when Mohammed Deif comes in. He says, forget about the peace process. They keep killing us during all the ceasefires. And what we need to do is move away from suicide bombing and militarize and turn Gaza into the kind of cradle of resistance, a base for the guerrilla army. That's when the tunnel tactic. And so the tunnel tactic comes into play when Israel does its disengagement. And here's another important point to make. In 2005, Ariel Sharon, the most violent architect of Israeli occupation, who was then prime minister, announces a disengagement from Gaza. This means no more Israeli settlers and no more troops inside Gaza. It will be ruled from the outside through the panopticon military structure. That allows the resistance factions to start building tunnels under the Gaza Strip, tunnels into Egypt to bring supplies in, including mostly civilian supplies. And they had to do that to break the siege, but also to begin refining their tactics. And it was someone known as the engineer, Adnan Al-Ghul, who begins constructing workshops across the Gaza Strip to build rocket launchers, to start even trying to pioneer a drone, the technology that Israel invented. And Al-Ghul, of course, was killed, assassinated by Israel, but his engineering know-how was passed down under Deif's leadership to the point where today you now see the Al-Qassam Brigades going into combat with the most high-tech army probably in the world, or at least on par with the U.S. Army. With
that's what they call themselves.
Yeah, that's what they call themselves.
Tech is what you're proud of when you don't have fighters.
Exactly. Man. Well, when you're, and just on that point, why did Israel prioritize the drone UAVs? It was because during the first Lebanon war, its occupation of Beirut, they were losing so many soldiers that Israel saw the first kind of peace movement, or a movement for withdrawal by the mothers of dead soldiers or soldiers who'd been taken captive. Israel is a very casualty averse society. And so they wanted basically to fight wars with robots.
Right.
And Al-Qassam plays to that.
if I recall, all of this history is in your third book, The 51-Day War, about
Yeah,
how
there's a short history there, and I think it's worth reading that to understand. I mean, I think I correctly predicted the kind of combat, when anyone who followed this would have been able to say confidently that the Al-Qassam Brigades would perform very well in the field once Israel entered the Gaza Strip. And so keep in mind that for 2 weeks, Israel's been carpet bombing Gaza, including with bunker buster bombs, trying to target the tunnel network, killing anyone they think is related to Hamas. And now Israel, in the last 48 hours, according to the Israeli military, and I think the number is much higher, has lost 18 soldiers in the field. Here's a look at some of the combat footage that was published by the Al-Qassam Brigades. I'm not going to show anything from October 7th because that might get this whole thing banned, but they basically wasted the entire Israeli military's entire Gaza division on October 7th. Most Israeli deaths that day were military-age people. This is another fact that you'll never hear in Western media. They want to make it out to be just like a slaughter of civilians, but the bases were completely overrun. And now here is combat, close quarters combat between the Al-Qassam Brigades, as well as Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Israeli military with tanks.
And how have they been able to, oh, you're going to show this.
So this is west of the Erez crossing in the north by Beit Hanun, which is the nexus of the Israeli siege of Gaza. And these are open fields where Israel stationed its tanks. And Anya and I have actually, we've passed through this buffer zone. So there are a lot of there's a lot of high grass there, which can be used as shelter by guerrilla fighters. And you see them moving out of the tunnel, which obviously Israel failed to eliminate. These are rocket-propelled grenades, and they're going to approach a tank formation. And we'll see some pretty dramatic footage towards the end, filmed with a drone. And this is textbook Al-Qassam tactics. Getting into close quarters with Israeli forces neutralizes air power because air support would kill those soldiers.
Yeah, but Israel has no problem doing that.
Well, that's what we're going to see more and more of. So look at this. I mean, look at that tank formation. First of all, it's military folly to have your tanks that close together, as we saw with Russian tanks getting hit by early on in Ukraine. It opens you up to mortar fire, artillery fire. Hamas doesn't have, or Al-Qassam doesn't have artillery, but look at where they've managed to destroy tanks, dislodge men. They've claimed to have destroyed at least 22 armored vehicles already in the Gaza Strip.
This is an element of the war that the Western media don't show you. They don't actually speak about this war in military terms, just as they didn't discuss the events of October 7th in military terms, or just analyze what actually happened from a military perspective, that Hamas had a military objective to enter Israeli society, raid military bases and targets, and take hostages back to Gaza. But now, if you watch the mainstream media, all you hear about we've heard about the impending Israeli invasion, ground invasion for 3 weeks now, maybe almost 4. And what they leave out is that it seems, from my view, that the Israelis are trying. They have been, for these weeks, attempting to make the ground invasion happen, and they can't do it. And so we don't hear about these skirmishes. We don't actually hear about the Israelis that are dying. We have no idea, really, even because Israel's not going to give us accurate figures of what's happening in terms of the man-to-man combat on the ground in Gaza right now. Do you think that's an accurate read? Does it seem like the Israelis are attempting repeatedly this ground invasion and then getting beat back?
Yeah. Yes. And they're covering up their losses.
And the Western media do not discuss it at all.
The Israelis, first of all, got advice from James Glynn, who was a U.S. colonel, I believe, may have been a general, who oversaw the U.S. counterinsurgency campaigns in Fallujah and Mosul. He's, the butcher of Fallujah, where the U.S. Engaged in a shake and bake operation and doused that city with white phosphorus, which we see Israel using day after day on civilian areas in Gaza. And then Mosul, was destroyed. Much of the city was destroyed in order to dislodge ISIS. But Glynn appeared to have shaken his head and walked away from his consultations with the Israeli military and said, this is paraphrasing his quote, "Whatever Israel does is their decision." What he's basically saying is that they don't really have a strategy or a plan, and they weren't necessarily listening to me when I warned them about going into Gaza. And so what they're doing right now in Gaza is they've moved into areas in the north, like Sudania, where there are like resorts, and there's farmland in the north, as we see where their tanks are, just empty land, the buffer zone. And they're unable to move further into more heavily built up urban areas, because that's where the element of surprise is going to doom them. And they've basically established these bases, de facto bases inside Gaza, but it's unclear where they're going to go next. They haven't started the march into Gaza City, and they don't have a political objective. They say they want to topple Hamas. How are they going to do that? What will they replace it with? And meanwhile, they're taking losses.
That they're essentially saying they're waging a regime change war on Gaza, which from the U.S. perspective, we should know at that point never really works out. Right. If your goal is to go in and change a regime of a state, when has that worked in our favor? Now Israel's attempting to do that with Gaza, but really, let's be honest, that is not their objective here. It is very evident at this point that their goal, they're not going to have a real ground invasion. Their goal is to bomb Gaza. I think they want to just force them into the Sinai just through sheer force. And then the Israeli soldiers will march upon the ruins and claim that they've expanded greater Israel to the Mediterranean Sea there. So, let's not kid ourselves. The goal is not for the Israelis to come in there and do special ops and ground invasion to get these hostages. The Israelis do not care.
They have no strategy for that. And I've heard I've heard a former Israeli colonel say that the reason they've established these bases in Gaza is so that the captives will just run out and then they can rescue them. But we've even heard in the words of a captive that she screamed at Netanyahu on camera and said, you just want to get us all killed? Yeah. What are you doing? But
is it fair to say that is the objective? That is the Israeli military objective at this point. It is to just waste Gaza and clear everybody out to south.
Yes, and they're going to have a hard time doing it. This was 3 days ago. Here is an Israeli Panther armored personnel carrier getting hit by a Cornet missile, which is the wire-guided anti-tank weapon that Hezbollah used to dislodge Israel from southern Lebanon in the late 90s. And this Panther contained at least 14 soldiers. So they're basically sitting ducks there against a very hardened guerrilla army, who have also demonstrated their ability to use drones against Israeli Merkava tanks on October 7th. They've even begun introducing into the field, and I doubt these will have any effect, but the Al-Qassam Brigades have now introduced anti-aircraft devices. This is the first video ever seen of anti-aircraft devices used by this guerrilla army with heavily reliant on homemade weapons in the Gaza Strip. And it's a propaganda video, but it does show their ability to advance under siege and constant bombing. If they are somehow ever able to neutralize Israeli air power, it's unclear what Israel will be able to do. These look like they're at best able to strike Apache helicopters used for close quarter support, like kind of combined operations.
So I think the sound is out there to lower it. But just to step away, to move away from the technical aspect and the history for a minute, because I think it's all good, but sometimes that gets a lot for people to absorb. And in day-to-day life right now, whether it's on Twitter or with people in person, a lot of what we're confronting is rhetoric. Yeah. And so I want you to respond to one point that I hear a lot when we see videos like that, or when we hear about Hamas's or the Qassam Brigades, their incredible military capacity, considering they're under siege. You have Zionists like Ben Shapiro, for example. A major talking point they always make is the Palestinians in Gaza are complaining that they're under siege. They have no food, they have no water, they have no electricity. And Hamas is using all of these resources to build homemade rockets. And they had that propaganda push where they said that Hamas used some, was it water pipes? Part of the water system to build rockets and to lob them at Israel. What rhetorically just do you say to the, because it's such a cheap and ridiculous point, but how do you confront that talking point when people that are pro-Israel see videos like that? They say, see, the Palestinians aren't so poor and helpless. It's just that their Hamas leadership is choosing to invest in rockets and a military to kill Jews instead of feeding their own population.
Well, Hamas does have a social services network, which is one of its key bases of support. It provides free food and education and youth camps in place of the actual state structure, because they're not allowed to have a state. But one of the key sources of metal and explosives in the Gaza Strip, and this has even been reported in mainstream outlets like Reuters, is repurposed Israeli bombs. When I would walk through places like Beit Hanun that had been destroyed in 2014, people would constantly warn me, don't go in there. There's a giant unexploded bomb. And they have bomb disposal teams, which either disarm the bombs or take them apart. And then they repurpose them and transform them along with their metal into rockets. So a lot of the rockets being fired towards Tel Aviv or Ashkelon were actually first bombs dropped on civilian neighborhoods in Gaza, which failed to explode. It's the ultimate irony and revenge. And then, of course, we look at the nature of these homemade weapons that Hamas is relying on. I mean, these are just the basics of guerrilla warfare. The fact that they can develop anything like an anti-aircraft system is amazing. Whether you hate them or not, it is a testament to ingenuity. And I guarantee you, if you look at those, that their military budget is a lot lower than Israel's. It's a whole lot lower than the United States' as a percentage of whatever GDP exists in the Gaza Strip. Beyond that, it's like that old anti-drug ad where the dad walks into his kid's room and whips out the box of like the kid's stash and said, where did you get this from? Where did you learn this from? And the kid said, I learned it from watching you, Dad.
Well, yeah,
they've learned it from, they've learned this from their oppressor, and they're using their oppressor's tactics. And I guarantee you the vast majority of those guys who went into Israeli territory on October 7th with weapons, killed soldiers or killed non-combatants, I guarantee you the vast majority of them have lost family members in Israeli airstrikes in past Israeli assaults, maybe 80%.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a cheap, cynical point to say, to deny the Israeli siege because Hamas is able to, under these circumstances, create military, as if they have no right to resist. Of course, we know that they do, but somehow people have this logic that because they're able to build rockets and defend themselves militarily, that they could somehow be feeding all of Gaza and get electricity up and running. I mean, that's the point that I'm trying to discuss, is that it is, they say, as if it's either or. No, if you're under siege and there's someone telling you what you can and cannot even bring in terms of seeds and foods and everything that you grow and produce inside of your country, what else Oh, what are you supposed to do? I mean,
yeah, I remember in 2009 or 8, Thomas Friedman wrote that Gaza could have been a Dubai on the Mediterranean. And we constantly hear that rhetoric, like Trump Tower would have been constructed in the heart of
yeah, it could have
Jabalia.
if Israel had never been created.
And Gaza actually used to be relatively wealthy before Oslo. And Arafat would prefer to spend time there because it was nicer. There were seaside resorts. It's been deliberately, systematically impoverished by the occupation. And it's controlled not only from the eastern side, where it's surrounded by walls and fences, but also from the sea, so that the fisher, one of the traditional industries in Gaza, fishing, has been driven into ruin. And that when I'm in the Gaza Strip, I often eat fish imported from Alexandria, Egypt. I've been on a fishing boat with fishermen in Gaza. It was turned back by the Israeli Navy at gunpoint before they could get any real fish, any catch. And during, these assaults on Gaza, the Israeli Navy boats come in and you see them right out there on the sea firing shells, just lobbing shells randomly into the city. The Bakr boys, the sons of a fishing family, the Bakr family in Gaza City, were slaughtered by an Israeli Navy ship in front of the international press. Because remember the hotel we stayed at in Gaza in 2018? And they have a restaurant called Roots, and you're sitting out there on the beach. It's like pretty nice if you take the occupation out of it. All these reporters from The Guardian, AP, they were all sitting at that restaurant. All of a sudden, Israel lobs a shell onto the beach and blows up all these boys who the reporters had gotten to know because they would like fetch them things from the beach, slaughtered them. And so that was in 2014. That was the first real scandal. So for the first time, the Al-Qassam Brigades have introduced a torpedo, something to target those naval ships, which are responsible for so many massacres in the Gaza Strip and which have destroyed the industry of fishing in Gaza. And here's a look at them bringing this torpedo into the field for the first time. It's called the Asif. This is the propaganda video, but I'll show the actual video of them deploying it. It's a remote-controlled torpedo. I don't think it struck its target, and it says torpedo on it. You can see how advanced their military is and how they're just, taking so much money from the people. They put this, they made a torpedo. It actually says torpedo on it. And this is what it looks like when they're bringing it into the field. 1 second, and I'll tee it up. And you'll see this is, there's no way that this cost anything to do. It just took a little bit of ingenuity. It certainly doesn't cost as much as the Israeli naval ships and the cruiser class attack boats, and Dolphin submarines that they're gifted by Germany as part of Holocaust reparations. So here's them taking torpedo out onto the beach. This is from this week. So basically some guys walk a torpedo into the waves and then send it on its way. They don't have submarines. Their naval ships are actually converted fishing boats where they've had several infiltrations of Israeli territory at the Zakim naval base. So, I mean, that pretty much provides the answer to, they're stealing from their people to make this giant military. And the military is a people's military, as I said. It consists of many people young people I've interviewed there and met there who have lost family members, who want to regain their dignity.
Because that's Gaza. The Gaza, you can't say it enough that it's a modern concentration camp. The people there have nothing, no future, no hope other than breaking the siege. I mean, any human being, especially if you believe in the American tradition, would relate to their struggle.